Well, hello, I'm Gwen Whistler, the Chair of the Finance and Human Resources Committee of the Asheville City Council. Welcome to our September 27th remote meeting. All of our council, committee members, and staff are participating virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We're streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city's website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone. For those of you out there with us today, welcome. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number, 855-925-2801, meeting code 5257. Your phone will be muted and you will hear the meeting live. At this point, speakers will need to push *3 to enter the speaker queue. I'll now go through and introduce all the committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Please make sure to mute your microphone if you're not speaking. When you would like to speak, unmute your microphone and remember to mute it after you finish speaking. So I'm going to, let me just check my list, whether it's close to right. Okay. I may leave off some city staff people, but we'll be okay. Councilwoman Sandra Kilgore, if you just say a quick hello.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi. Councilwoman Sage Turner.
Good afternoon.
And with their cats. City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Hello.
And I don't see the assistant manager. So Finance Director Tony McDowell.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay. And then some of the other staff will introduce, I guess, as we go along. Okay. So the first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. Are there any questions or changes to the minutes?
None, and I'll make a motion.
Great. And I need a second.
I'll second. Sandra.
Okay, lovely. So with that, I'll do a roll call vote. Sandra Kilgore.
Aye.
Sage Turner.
Aye.
And I'm an aye. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is an update from the CFO. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tony McDowell, our Finance Director, and Becky Ogles, the Assistant Finance Director. So take it away, Tony and Becky.
Thanks, Glenn. This is Becky Ogles, Assistant Finance Director, and I'm actually going to get us started with this.
Oh, lovely. Thanks, Becky.
Yes, you're welcome. So we're just going to give you an update on the year end because we are getting close to our deadline. Next slide, please, Alicia. So just some key takeaways. We are on track still to complete our year-end audit on October 31st. The process is underway, has been underway, and we still feel good that we will complete it by that deadline. While we do have some preliminary year-end information, which I think Tony is going to share with you guys a little bit later, there is still a lot of work to be done. The next 4 weeks, we go through a lot of different testing and review, so there still might be a little bit of changes throughout the next couple of weeks. This year, it's super important for us to get the audit done on time, October 31st, because we do need to go to the LGC for some new debt come the beginning of the new calendar year. So next slide, please, Alicia. So I think we've presented these to you guys before, but this is just kind of our year-end audit calendar. We are in the midst of our final field work. Our auditors are actually here on site this week. They have been testing a lot of different things, but things are still progressing and moving along well. So like I said, the week of, or August 31st, or October, 31st, we should be able to submit everything to the LGC. Next slide, Alicia, please. So just to let you guys kind of know what happens over the next 4 weeks, I think last month we presented to you the major programs. Those are the major grant programs that we will be testing this year. There's a lot of them. So this is really the week that the auditors really dig into that and request contracts, invoices, just everything that they might need just to make sure that everything is good with those programs. They also do testing on revenue, receivables, and expenses. We provided a trial balance to them on September 16th. We have made a couple of adjustments since then. Most of it was stuff that we just did not have prior to that date. We do have an accrual cycle through the end of September. So we are still monitoring those, and we might still have a couple more adjustments to come this week. Next comes the drafting of our notes, our tables, and all of our financial statements. That'll kind of happen starting next week. We will get some draft financial statements from our auditors that we will review. And as I've mentioned, it is our hope to submit everything to the LGC by October 31st. So at this point, I will pass it off to Tony.
All right. Well, thanks, Becky. So as Becky mentioned, at our last meeting with you all back in August, we told you all that we would provide you with some preliminary results. Like Becky said, there's a lot of work that still has to be done over the next 4 weeks, particularly around getting us to that final fund balance number in the general fund, which I know is something we're all interested in seeing where we landed for fund balance. But we do have some preliminary results, and we wanted to talk to you all just briefly about 3 areas: our sales taxes, and then kind of how we have, or how it looks like we're going to end the year in our parking and transit funds. And if you all may remember, those funds in particular were ones that we talked a lot about during the budget process last year. So with that, Alicia, you can go on to the next slide if you want. So sales taxes. I think you all know our sales taxes run 3 months behind the revenue that we get back from the state. And so when it takes about 3 months from the time the revenue is collected by businesses, it gets to the state processes all that, and then they send the money back out to local governments. And so for that reason, when we were talking to you all during the budget process, at that time we only had about 9 months worth of sales tax revenue that we could share and that we could do projections off of. So we have gotten our last 3 months. The final month, the June month, came in about 2 weeks ago. And for the year, our sales taxes ended up 17% compared to the previous year. And that's by far the largest increase that we've had over the last 10 years. It actually came on the heels of a 16% growth the previous year. So between fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, we've really seen some unprecedented growth in our sales tax revenue. Average sales tax growth, just to kind of give you all an idea, in what I call a normal year, is usually around 5%. So the growth that we've seen the last 2 years really has been historic in some ways. We looked back over the last 10 years, and it's definitely the highest growth we've seen in the last 10 years, and it may be even in the last 20 years or so. Now, some of the growth this year, fiscal year 22, was tied to the increase in inflation, obviously, with prices being up about 8%. With higher prices, you're going to pay more in sales taxes on top of that. And so that did drive some of the increase in the current year. But still, pretty unprecedented growth over the last 2 years in sales taxes, which has allowed us to fund a lot of things in our general fund over the last 2 budget cycles. Where do we go from here? Great question. Obviously, we haven't gotten any sales tax revenue for the new fiscal year that we just started. And I think, as you all know, there's a lot of economic uncertainty out there right now. The Fed increased interest rates again last week. And so it's likely that our economic growth is going to slow down some in the current fiscal year. And we're going to begin providing some kind of current year updates to you all when we bring you the first quarter financial report late next month. So you can move on to the next slide, Alicia. So on our parking fund, so you all may remember back during the budget process, we talked to you all a lot about how we were having some challenges, particularly in our garages, with revenues being under budget due to the pandemic, the lingering impacts of the pandemic, and also some equipment issues that were happening in the garage during fiscal year 22. the garage is. And so just to kind of give you all an update. So we did some estimates back in April. And the good news is that over the last 3 months of last fiscal year, the garage and meter revenues both performed better than we had estimated. So the parking fund did end up a little bit better than what we had estimated back in April. Revenues did still come in under budget. The overall budget for the parking fund is about $7 million, and we think revenues are going to come in somewhere around $5 million. So again, that was better than we had estimated. It was better than we did the previous year, fiscal 21, but it was still under the budget and under kind of historically where garage and meter revenue ends up. And so for that reason, we did not make the transfer from the parking to the transit fund in fiscal year 22. I think, as you all know, that's about a $1.6 million transfer that we've been making between those two funds to support the transit operations. But because of the underperformance on the revenue side in the parking fund, we did not make that transfer to transit. And then kind of bottom line, where we think we're going to end up in the parking fund for fiscal year 22 is it looks like revenues are going to be a little above expenses, probably somewhere around $600,000 to $650,000 for fiscal year 22, and that will kind of go into the parking fund balance, which again we'll have more information on that after the actual after the audit is wrapped up here in 2 weeks. So next slide, please. So on the transit fund, I think as you all know, and again, we talked to you all a lot about this during the budget process, is that on the expense side of the transit fund budget, we came in well under budget. And the primary reason for that was that we had budgeted, we began fiscal year 22 with a budget that assumed that we would be expanding service midway through fiscal 22. With the staffing shortages, especially with the bus drivers, we did not make that planned expansion. And so our expense budget for the transit management contract came in well under budget, as well as our expense budget for paratransit services. As I mentioned already, we didn't make the transfer from parking to transit. And then kind of overall for the transit fund, preliminary results indicate that revenues are going to be pretty equal, or roughly equal to expenses for last fiscal year. And they're actually very close to what we had estimated they would be back in April. So we think the transit fund is going to break even for fiscal year 22. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, just kind of begin wrapping up. So upcoming meetings that we'll be presenting to you all, we really have one more meeting coming up before we finish the audit. That'll be you all's meeting in late October. And we should be really close by that point to having the audit wrapped up. So we hope to be able to provide you all with some preliminary estimates for our general fund balance at your meeting in October. And then we'll be back pretty quickly after that on November 15th to do the joint meeting between the Finance and HR Committee and the Audit Committee for the formal presentation by our auditors of the fiscal year 22 year-end report. So next slide. So just to finish and to come back to the key takeaways, Becky mentioned the process is underway and we're still on schedule. Auditors are here. Actually, they were actually in our conference room today. We had to move them over to another conference room so Alicia could broadcast the meeting that we're having currently. And even though there's a lot of work been done already, there's still a lot of work to be done over the next 4 weeks. Becky and her team are going to be really busy wrapping things up with the auditors, and we'll hopefully have some good results to present to you all here in the next 4 to 6 weeks or so. So with that, I think that's our last slide, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Sage?
Thank you, Tony and Becky. Curious, so when the parking fund doesn't transfer to the transit fund, when those revenues don't transfer, do we have to take action on that? I thought it was something we expressly allowed because enterprise to enterprise. What is the formality there? We just cannot transfer it some years?
Yeah, so the parking fund by law has to make enough money in revenue to support its own expenses before it can make the transfer to transit. And we were a little concerned, back when we were talking to you all during the budget process, that the parking fund was going to perhaps even lose money, and that's why we did not plan to make the transfer at all. And then, like I said, over the last 3 months or so, revenues did better than expected. So it did end up making a little bit of money for last fiscal year. But yeah, you all don't need to take any action on that. It'll just fall into their fund balance and be available for them to use in future years.
What about all of the parking equipment? Does anyone know if it's all fully functioning yet? Is this like a fully active parking deck set of revenues? I mean, do we know?
I believe that the garage equipment is functioning at the moment. I'm not aware of any outages, but we can follow up on that and get back to you all.
Okay. And then one last question. Sales tax. Can you remind me what percentage of the overall sales tax that goes to the state comes back to the city?
Yeah. So, and I can't remember that percentage off the top of my head, but yeah, that we share. So the state sales tax overall, I think, is around 7%. Some of that goes directly to the state. Some of it comes back to local governments. And the part that comes back to local governments, we share in that with Buncombe County and all the other municipalities in the county. And we currently get somewhere around 20% of what comes back to Buncombe County. Now, the overall percent, when you compare that to the overall percent that's collected and the amount that goes to the state, it's a much smaller percent.
Okay, because I think it's 2.25 automatically goes to the county and 4.75 goes to the state. So 20% of the 2.75 comes to us and some of the state. Is that right?
Yeah, so approximately 20% of what comes back to Buncombe County stays with us. But you're right.
Okay. Whether it's from the state or that 2.25. Okay.
Exactly.
I guess I was trying to extrapolate in my head what 17% growth in sales tax at a city level means for economic growth for the area. Like it's just a big number. And if it's some like fraction of a percent, then the actual total revenues coming into some of our local businesses and stuff is pretty large. And I just haven't heard any reporting on that. So I was kind of curious. But that's all my questions. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, we look forward to the audit coming in with no comments and on time. That would be a really nice gift to Gwen.
Oh, your last audit, Gwen.
I know.
Here's to that. Good luck, Tony.
Yeah. Here's to that. Okay. So thank you so much for that. And looking forward to the final update. So the next item is the general obligation bond projects. And so Tony McDowell and Nikki Reed, Community and Economic Development Director. And Jade, are you going to speak too, or you just hanging out with us?
Just here for answer questions if needed.
Okay, great. So with that, so this is, we got a small update on this from a project perspective at the last city council meeting. And, but this is sort of the financial status update, and not so much status update on the actual projects themselves, right? So Nikki, are you going to take this one or is Tony?
So I'm going to kick off. Nikki and I are going to double team it. I'm going to kick off and start it, and then she's going to join in later. So yeah, thanks you all. And yeah, the next agenda item is a financial update on the 2016 GeoBond program. And Tony McDowell, Finance Director, I'm going to cover the first few slides, and then I'll hand it over to Nikki Reed, our Community and Economic Development Director, to cover the housing piece of this. And we have Jay Dundas, our Capital Projects Director, here as a resource as well. So Alicia, you can go to the next slide. So just some key takeaways from the slides today. So the 2016 General Obligation Bond Program, it totaled $74 million. That was the amount of money that was approved by the voters. It's successfully allowed the city over the last 7 years to undertake a number of key high priority projects in transportation, parks, and affordable housing. And we'll show you some of those projects that have been completed and some of the money that's been spent over the last few slides. We do have several major sidewalk GeoBond projects that are still to come, and council is going to be seeing those come before you all over the next 6 to 9 months for award of the bid for those contracts. And we'll show you a list of those projects too in the next few slides. Nikki Reed's going to join us to talk about the recommendations that staff has for utilizing the remaining money that has not been spent from the Affordable Housing GO bond. And specifically, we're going to recommend utilizing that money in the Housing Trust Fund. Nikki and her team presented last week at the HCD committee. So I think Councilmember Turner may have already heard part of this presentation, but we wanted to share it with you all as well. And then we also want to highlight that we will have all the bonds issued. There's a 7-year deadline that the Local Government Commission puts in place for issuance of GO debt. And that is coming up a little over a year from now, and we'll have all the debt issued by then. And I'll kind of walk you all through where we are with that. So you can go to the next slide. So just a little background. So the $74 million bond program, the GO bond program, was approved by city voters in November of 2016, so almost 7 years ago. It was $32 million for transportation, $17 million for parks and recreation, and $25 million for affordable housing. And I put the voter approval percentages there in parentheses so you all could see those. And also wanted to highlight that this was our first successful GO bond referendum in about 30 years. And I think a couple takeaways from this slide, I'd say the first being just looking at the voter approvals. I know that there's consideration of doing another GO bond referendum, perhaps in 2024. And so I think looking back at this one from 2016 and looking at the approval rates, the high percentage approval for the bond, I think bodes well for a potential 2024 bond, a successful 2024 bond, if council chooses to pursue one. And then the other takeaway I think from this slide was prior to 2016, we had not had a ongoing GO bond program for a very, very long time. And I think that has created challenges with our capital infrastructure. Most cities our size tend to have a program that's pretty routine and they're issuing debt every few years. And so because we didn't have an ongoing program, it has created some challenges for us and just in keeping up with our capital needs. So next slide, please. So I want to pause just for a moment on this slide. So this is a financial summary, kind of where we're at with the GO bond program as of the end of August. And there's just a couple things I wanted to highlight on this slide. The first is just kind of go through these columns. So the first column there is the amount of money that was issued and approved by voters back in 2016, totaling $74 million. That second column, and I think this is something we probably haven't talked enough about throughout the program, is the money that we've brought into the GO bond program. The GO bond program has allowed us to leverage those original $74 million to expand the program, bring in grants, bring in donations, and actually create a CIP, a GO bond CIP program that's larger than $74 million. It's actually closer to $91.5 million with those additional funding sources that the original GO bond money has allowed us to bring in. And I'll kind of, on the next slide, I'll kind of highlight for you all what some of those additional funding opportunities are that we brought in. So again, the $74 million program that started out in 2016 has grown to a program now that is at $91.5 million with that additional funding that we brought in. We've spent or encumbered $60.8 million of that $91 million. So there's about $30 million still remaining to be spent from the program. And the biggest part of that is in the transportation area, where we have about $18 million remaining to be spent. And again, we'll kind of highlight for you all some of the major sidewalk projects that are still upcoming with that remaining $18 million. Next slide, please. So again, just to kind of highlight, and again, I think this really is an important part of the program, is that $74 million bond issuance has allowed us to bring in other monies to utilize alongside of it. And so here's some examples of those other dollars. We have about $4.7 million that we've gotten from the NPO that's being utilized for some of the transportation and sidewalk projects. I think, as you all know, back during the budget process, we allocated $2.5 million from the ARPA funding for the Memorial Stadium project, which is one of the bond projects. We partnered with MSD, the Metropolitan Sewerage District, as we were completing the Haywood Street streetscape project. And they came in and did some underground sewer work while we were doing some of the work above ground. And that was about a $1.7 million project that they did alongside the project that we were working on. We also brought in a $1.25 million donation from the Dogwood Foundation that helped with the purchase of the Talbert lot, and that's one of the affordable housing projects that we've completed. And there was also some donation money that was associated with the work that was done at the Jake Rusher Park as well. And then finally, we've utilized some of our own resources within the city, some of our pay as you go cash from our CIP, and also some of our existing debt capacity within our regular CIP to supplement the bond money that was approved back in 2016. So next slide, please. So just a quick update, financial update on the transportation GO bond projects. And you can go to the next slide, Alicia. So just some projects that have been completed so far. And we showed you all a slide with some similar information, I think back during the budget process, that highlighted some of the projects. And I won't go through all these, but I think the biggest one to note there is the road resurfacing. We've spent over $10.5 million already on resurfacing and improving our roads. That Haywood Streetscape project that I mentioned on the previous slide was a $4.5 million project. And then we've done a number of other projects, including sidewalks, some greenway connectors, and also some multimodal improvements that included traffic calming, some replacement and upgrade of bus shelters, and also some traffic signal projects as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we do have some major transportation projects that are still to be completed. Most of those are sidewalk projects. We also have the Swannanoa Greenway project. And this chart lays out a schedule for you all of the anticipated bid dates for these projects. So you all will be seeing a number of these coming back to you all over the next 6 to 9 months at the council level for approval of the construction contracts. We do anticipate there will be some funds left over once all these projects are bid out, and that remaining funding will be rolled into doing additional street resurfacing. All right, next slide, please. Okay, shifting gears over to the parks projects, and you can go on to the next one. So again, some examples of projects that have been completed to date. The biggest piece of spending, I think, on the parks side so far has been the sports courts and playgrounds and ball fields, and those are some examples of ones that have been completed. We've spent a little over $3.5 million on those projects. There's also been significant work at Jake Rusher, the Tempe Avery Complex, Richmond Hill Park, along with the acquisition of land on Sweeten Creek Road as well. So next slide. There are some projects that are underway. There's not as much money left on the Parks GO side as there is on the transportation side, and most of that money is already obligated to kind of two major projects. And Jade has been providing you all with some regular status updates on both of these, so I won't really spend a whole lot of time on them. But the Grant Center project, as you all know, is underway. That's a $9 million project with an estimated completion date of June 2023. The Mountainside Memorial Improvement Project is also budgeted. That's about a $6.6 million total project, and we're anticipating award of construction of that next March with a completion date of May 2024. Much like with the transportation bond program, we do think there's going to be some money left over. And so staff has identified some projects that those remaining funds would go to. And that includes potentially the playground at the Murphy Oakley Park, the ball field playground and lighting and swings at Weaver Park, and also sport court work at the Roger Farm Park as well. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki to talk about the affordable housing GO bond projects.
Can I grab you for a second, Tony?
Sure.
So can you go back to the previous slide? I just want to make sure I understand the Mountainside Memorial improvements. This is or is not including the stadium? Because I know there's the relocation of Parks building, and then there's some actual work. Is this actually including the stadium, the 4.2 million?
Yeah, this would include I believe this number includes both phases. I know in fact it is the second phase, which would include the track and the all of the removal of the stands and all that. So this is definitely reflective of that.
So I was gonna ask before this slide came up if there were any of the Geo Park bonds left to help with the expense of the Memorial Stadium. And I see it under this list, but it's not all Geo bond funds, right? I mean, this is just a list of park things we're going to be doing, but it's on the tail of a Geo bond explanation. But the Memorial Stadium isn't from the bond funds.
Yes, there's the first phase was entirely bond funded, and then there's a portion that is a portion of the second phase that is bond funded as well.
I guess it's just getting a little hazy when presented like this. And I just want to make sure that we understand, like, some of the rescue plan money was for the track and some of the bond money was for some original phasing, but that we're not using the Geo bond money that taxpayers voted for to do the soccer field or the track. Correct? And just making sure that's clear, because on these slides, it's not very clear like that. So I'm just making sure that's
Gotcha.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And I'll just see, it kind of goes back to that first slide where we were trying to show that we've utilized other funding sources for some of these projects as well. But
Just
yeah, sure.
remaining projects. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll get started on the affordable housing piece. Alicia, if you want to go ahead and cue up the slides. I'm also joined today by Sasha Vertunsky, who is the city's affordable housing officer. She gave the presentation to the HCD committee a week or so ago, and so she's here to answer any detailed questions that we might have. But first, we wanted to demonstrate also some example projects that the affordable housing bonds have funded. And so you're seeing there in the images, Maple Crest Apartments. That reflects also the acquisition of 319 Biltmore that was purchased with bond funds. Of course, that teed up the partnership with Laurel Streets Residential for the redevelopment of that site for mixed income housing. The other image highlights 360 Hilliard, which was a city-owned property that was redeveloped for mixed income housing here close to downtown. So that's showing some of those investments. Other land banking investments that we can highlight, 50 Ashland Avenue, as you saw earlier, leveraging Dogwood funds to help purchase that site. And then last there, showing that the Community Land Trust was also a group that was funded and did some capital acquisitions with the $1 million of bond funding there. So just some highlights about some completed projects. Next slide. So really, if we look at big picture, that should be an active link. So if you want to take a look and dive deep into some of the details of the affordable housing bond, you can link, and that will pull up a prior HCD review where we went in depth in terms of really what the return on investments were for the affordable housing bond. But we've captured it here just looking at the overall return here, with about 32.5 acres purchased with bond funds, over 403 affordable housing units constructed, and then 197 affordable units in the pipeline to be constructed. That's inclusive of the Laurel Street project that was the most recent brought before council. So when looking at this and when thinking about what is remaining now with the remaining funding from the bond, we really thought that the Housing Trust Fund has been one of the most successful tools in leveraging affordable housing bond funding. You see that Tony is really talking about leverage from city internal sources, but I think it's important to recognize that the Housing Trust Fund in particular also leverages private sources of funding, whether it's bank financing, other institutions like Buncombe County funding affordable housing. So that leverage really does extend beyond just city dollars for investments in affordable housing. And so we are working through the HCD committee. They'll consider staff recommendations after we cycle through more committee review. Next slide. So a quick snapshot here. So out of the $25 million affordable housing bond, we see that $5 million was initially allocated towards Housing Trust Fund. Land banking shows up as the other expense there, $1 million to ABCLT. When looking at all of the expenses associated with the city-owned land initiative, that comes in about $8 million. And then deed review phase 1 that came before council earlier this year partnership with the Housing Authority on the redevelopment of the Deaverview apartments there and allocating $1.465 million for that. So that's where we get our remaining balance of about 6.5. Next slide. So again, kind of looking at how our investments have really gotten us here. And what we're seeing is that when we invest in capacity building in new nonprofits, really the ABCLT is highlighted, as well as the Haywood Street Community Development Group, which received bond funding for their project on West Haywood Street. That really does take time to pay off. When we're seeing new nonprofits really start and get into the work of affordable housing, that does take time. So when we look at a bond timeline, we just want to be cognizant of that and really how long it does take to build that kind of capacity in new nonprofits. We also recognize the city-owned land policy was created during this time frame, and so really recognizing that policies need to be in place to guide decision-making prior to those investments being made. So what we're kind of reflecting on is the fact that the Housing Trust Fund, we've seen a lot of straightforward success there, high leverage again with of those bond dollars. And two, we'll see that it's a flexible funding source that's been able to be used for a wide range of affordable housing types and serve different populations that need housing in our community. Next slide. And here's where I'll kind of dig into that a little bit. So we're showing here the investments of the initial $5 million allocation from bond funds into the Housing Trust Fund. And so we funded Amaranth Apartments. That was a tax credit project where we were able to leverage bond funds with tax credits to achieve 70 units of affordable housing. Like I said, 360 Hilliard, that was actually a larger project. 34 units were affordable out of that mixed income project. So that was a mixed income opportunity. Swananoa Bend, Simpson Street, that was a private developer that does affordable housing there. Habitat, so homeownership is also an eligible use within our Housing Trust Fund. So we're seeing that reflected, as well as Homeward Bound, so housing for people moving out of homelessness into homes. So I think, again, what we're seeing reflected in our investments is that wide range of housing opportunities that were afforded through the Housing Trust Fund. Next slide. So that leads us to our current staff recommendation. So recommending that the remaining bond funds from the Affordable Housing Bond totaling 6.5, how we would look to invest that, which reserve $500,000 for planning on city-owned land. This is really including the Deaverview property that was purchased during this bond timeframe to really do some in-depth planning, some site design, hopefully concept design to really understand the future of that property, and then to allocate the remaining to the Housing Trust Fund. What this also allows us to do is once we allocate these funds to the Housing Trust Fund, that's an existing policy that we can then work on refinements really to help target those funds based on current needs in our community. So we would be going through that process to really do any kind of fine-tune measures for that policy so that we make sure that we're meeting the needs. We've talked about, reserving funding for land acquisition, having additional guidelines for that land acquisition. Of course, council saw MHO's proposal not too long ago. And then also something else that's been important is to look at how we align better with our other funding partners, in particular Buncombe County. And so we are now working with staff on ways that we can work together on aligning our funding cycles so that decisions can be made in alignment and in better alignment, really, so that we can understand really the capital stack for each project as it comes through and as it comes through the request for funding from different sources. So next slide. So again, our review as we go through this process, first it would be a stop to the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, one of our citizen advisory committees. They're going to help us with that in-depth policy review of this allocation to ensure that it's on firm footing and to provide any additional information or any additional analysis on that. Then we would bring it back to HCD for really a formal endorsement in October, and then it would actually come to council for final authorization October 25th. And so Tony and I have been very careful to talk with our bond counsel and to ensure that we're aligning everything to conform with the bond timeline, as well as make sure that we're hitting the mark. And this will really help us to meet that objective as well. And then after the allocation has been formalized, then we can work on any of those policy considerations to the Housing Trust Fund and proceed with that on the November, December timeframe. Next slide. Okay, I think that's it. I will happy to answer any questions, but otherwise I'll turn it back over to Tony.
So Nikki, that, I mean, I think you've answered this, but let me ask it very directly. So just putting it into the Housing Trust Fund and not actually using it by the deadline of the bond fund is okay? Is an okay use? I suppose as long as it can't do anything but be in affordable housing, I guess is legal.
I see Tony went off mute, so I will let him answer that.
The short answer is yes. And Nikki mentioned that we've talked with our bond counsel about this actually on several occasions. And yes, as long as the money is allocated to the Housing Trust Fund,
Okay.
we'll have met the obligation.
Okay. And as long as there's no way it can come out and be spent on something else, right? Okay.
Correct.
Okay, I understand. Sage, you had your hand up?
Thank you, Nikki. Just one thing to share with council members that came up at HCD that I would love for y'all to be thinking about as this approach is coming to us, and that is something that wasn't on the slides and came up in HCD and will at AHAC is the down payment assistance. We originally allocated $1 million for that, but it kind of stumbled through a proposal period where we didn't have proposals come back to our RFP that really matched the criteria we were seeking. So we're going to have to face the decision of whether or not we want to kind of blend that into the HTF. We want to separate it out. If we want $1 million of the HTF to be allocated for down payment, just a conversation piece. We might want to be thinking about that because I know it was a pretty big initiative and we don't just want to leave it hanging out there unknown or unresolved. And then just to point out too, since HCD is kind of our boards and commissions pilot, what we did was ask AHAC to give us feedback on that. So they're going to come back to us, and I just want to explain that process because I think it's going to be pretty helpful. Other than that, no questions.
Okay, super. Thank you. And Nikki, on a completely, I realize we aren't getting into projects, but maybe later somebody can explain to me and, see how we're incorporating this. Every time I go by the Maple Crest Apartments and our big empty lot, there are cars lined up from Biltmore all the way up to Maple Crest on both sides. And what are those cars? And that's not a permanent game plan, right? So I'm just every time I go by, it's like, it doesn't look to me like people are doing work on the project. And so are those Maple Crest folks? And how's all that going to work? So, but again, you don't need to answer that today. Just maybe sometime someone can explain that to me because it doesn't look like a long-term good thing. So.
Gwen, one idea that came up in another meeting was, I guess it was HCD, that, they're building a 2-story deck, I think, precast. And if you engineer them right, you can just keep going up. And we suggested they consider reaching out to the county about perhaps another, like a level for childcare, or maybe it's another level of parking, the conversation that could be had amongst those community partners.
Maybe, yeah. Again, I don't know who those folks are that are parking there, but it's like, if we're going to add more, if we're actually going to, we are going to build on that property. I'm trying to figure out who's parking there, and long term, that's probably not a good place to be parking. But anyway, okay, later on. With that, I'll flip it over to Tony McDowell. Okay. I promised I wouldn't do that, but I did. I just went there. Sorry.
Well, thanks, Gwen. And so I'll cover the last few slides from the presentation, and then be happy to answer any more questions you all might have. So, and Alicia, you can go ahead and go to the next slide if you want. So the schedule that we talked about. So local governments in North Carolina have 7 years from the passage of a GO bond referendum to issue all of the debt that's associated with the referendum without requesting an extension from the local government commission. So for us, that 7-year deadline is coming up in November 2023. So we're about 14 months or so away from reaching that deadline. We have actually already issued a part of the debt. We issued $20.8 million in GO debt back in 2020. And that was based on projects that were already complete and money that was already spent by that point. We do currently have in place, and we mentioned this to you all, I think at your last meeting, a $25 million short-term bank loan for the other active GEO projects that are going on right now. And that short-term debt has to be converted to long-term debt by June of 2023. And that's part of the reason that we need to stay on schedule with our audit. And we've mentioned that to you all again the last couple of meetings as well. So we'll definitely be converting that $25 million over to long-term debt sometime before June of 2023. In total, we have, counting that $25 million, we have about $53 million in GEO debt that we still have to issue. We're in discussions right now with our financial consultants, and actually Andrew Carter from DEC is here for the next presentation. And we're talking with Andrew and his team about whether we want to issue all of the debt in early 2023 or issue only that part that we need to issue to refund this bank loan, and then wait and issue the second piece later in the year prior to November. And a lot of that's going to depend on kind of where interest rates are headed in the short run. We definitely want to try and make sure we take advantage of whatever we can work out schedule-wise to make sure we get the lowest interest rates possible. So we're going to continue to monitor that, continue to talk to Andrew and his team, and again, either do one issuance of debt in the first part of 2023, or split it into two and do one in the first part and the other in the later in the year. So I think with that, we come back to the next slide, which is the key takeaways. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have, but I hope you all have taken away from the presentation, and folks who may be watching out there in the community, that we think it's been a successful GEO bond program. It's provided the city with the resources to complete a number of key projects, and also to leverage that money to do even more than the original $74 million that was approved by voters. We do have some money still left to spend, some major sidewalk projects that are going to be bid out in the next 6 to 9 months, as well as the Housing Trust Fund allocation that Nikki talked to you all about as well. So with that, I think I'll stop, and again, happy to answer any questions you might have.
Sage?
Just real quick, one question. Tony, these the short-term bank loans, are they like in the private market, like a construction loan? Are they better rates?
So they are in the private market, which is with a bank. We issue an RFP, and banks submit proposals to us. And we work with Andrew and his team to analyze those proposals. And usually it comes down to whichever bank is offering us the best interest rate. And so those are private placement loans with a bank, yes.
But in general, are they better rates than the long term is what I'm getting at. Is it meant to be is it better to hold on to that short-term debt until the last minute possible?
So I think the answer to that is yes. If Andrew's here, he might want to weigh in as well. But the advantage of those short-term bank loans is we only pay interest on it. We don't pay principal. We pay interest, and we only pay interest on the money that we use. And so we're not paying interest right off the bat or principal on the full $25 million. So I think that's really the major advantage in terms of how the rates for those compared to the longer term debt. I actually don't know the answer to that, but Andrew, if you're there and want to chime in, be happy to.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Yeah, Tony, you're absolutely correct. They are short-term construction notes. So it's a very popular private sector type of way of financing. It's a variable rate. So it's based on a variable rate index with a spread. And yes, historically, that has been well below the percentage you would get on a long-term debt. Fixing it out. The other thing it does is the ability to, just as Tony said, you only pay on what you've drawn. And so as spending is slower maybe than anticipated and such, you only draw as you spend. And then as we do the takeout, as he said, in the January, February time period, we will take that out for the exact number of dollars that you've actually spent over that time period. Then we will probably do another issuance a little bit later in the year to clean up the remaining of the GEO money so that y'all will have it before the November expiration, and then can spend that out over the next year or so as those projects get spent out. So Tony was absolutely correct.
Thank you.
So I have, what I'm seeing now is, so we're going to be borrowing money for the $6 million left over for the in affordable housing. So we're going to be borrowing money to put in a savings account, kind of, right? So, I mean, again, this will probably not be my decision, but you know, that to me it should put the city under a lot of pressure to get those housing trust fund monies committed and spent, so that we're not just paying interest on money that's sitting completely unutilized. So, I mean, because, you know, I agree that we need to borrow the entire 74 million, I think, for a lot of reasons. And one of the big reasons being we want this to be successful, and people get that, you know, when we ask for a big bond amount, we are going to spend it wisely. But spending it wisely is not putting it in a savings account. And, you know, paying more money to borrow to just have it sit. So I would hope that council really understands that, like, we should feel a lot of pressure to get that $6.5 million invested in the community soon, because we are paying interest on it. And, you know, I'm not sure that's what the community had in mind. Sage?
That just 1 second, because I could have elaborated on the HCD, and Nikki touched on it as far as like aligning with the county schedule, but we do plan or hope to bring to council this idea that we would, you know, do an application period for all the remaining funding and tie it to the Buncombe County's affordable housing allocation period as well. And the hope would be that we actually have enough applicants to allocate money next year. Now, they may not be shovel ready, or, you know, it may not be spent right then, but I don't get the impression that, you know, we're trying to hold on to this for projects, typically how they just come to us at random. This is an intentional cycle and almost like a pilot of, should we look at it this way in the future? So maybe that helps a little. I think we'll be kind of pounding to get it spent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's we just, like, it would be not good, I think, if 4 years from now, those monies are still sitting in the housing trust fund waiting to be spent. So just, you know, because again, you know, it's one thing if it's fungible money that, you know, is just in the general fund, but when we have to borrow, and, you know, the constituents were very enthusiastic about approving our bond, you know, I think spending which, you know, frankly, I think we all knew that spending that much money when we didn't have much history in a 7-year period was going to be a challenge for the city of Asheville. I mean, it just is. But again, I just would put a lot of pressure on the city to get that money committed and spent. So
absolutely. And we've been pretty successful with it.
Oh, yeah, so far. But, you know, it's 20% of the affordable housing money. So, Deborah, I'm sorry, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I think if you don't mind, Ms. Whistler, I believe DEC Associates had their.
I apologize.
That's okay.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, my only comment was going to be, I think it's very common for many places around the state to spend housing money this way. The Parks and Rec and other projects, you can get shovels in the ground a little bit faster. Many of the affordable housing GO votes that are done, they tend to issue them in chunks and then try to spend those out, because you do have a lot more public-private partnerships you have to bring into the game. So yes, it is beneficial for the city to spend that money as fast as possible, but it is a little bit different animal than, say, Parks and Rec or transportation, simply because you do have some of the more complicated factors. But that's why we don't really want to, we've done the draw programs so that we don't issue the long-term debt until the money is spent, but we are bucking up against the 7-year deadline. And so we either have to kind of take our money and run and then try to spend it out, or we have to basically give up that authorization. There is the ability to go to the LGC and get approval to extend that a few more years, but that's, of course, completely up to council and staff recommendations.
And from our assessment and looking at the performance of the various programs that we have, Housing Trust Fund performs very well. And Nikki, please correct me if I'm wrong, we were transferring the funds hopefully in this budget area, because we actually don't have enough to support some of the initiatives and efforts that have and requests that have come. If I've mischaracterized anything, Nikki, please correct me.
Well, I just want to underscore that, yes, I think our recommendation to prioritize these funds for the Housing Trust Fund does reflect on our desire to see the funds invested into the community. I think I highlighted earlier some other initiatives just take time to grow them, like the ABCLT and Haywood Street Community Development. So if we can go with a tried and true, like the Housing Trust Fund, then our intent is to ensure that spend down, both fiscally responsible, but at the same time, making projects happen. And so that would be our intent with this recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have anything else before we move to the next item? Okay, so the next item is debt financing overview, and I will formally introduce Andrew Carter from DEC, who they come to talk to us and tell us all about, how much money we can borrow and how to borrow it. And, he is the master of acronyms, if I recall. So go, be patient with us, Andrew, but I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Tony.
All right. Well, thanks for that introduction, Gwen. I was going to introduce Andrew, but I think I can't top that for sure. But I did just want to take a quick moment and kind of tee up the next item. And it really does, it's kind of a continuation of the conversation we were just having. And it's also kind of the part one of a two-part conversation we want to have with you all between the meeting today and the meeting next month to talk about our upcoming CIP. Not only this year's CIP that Taylor Floyd, our budget manager, is going to be here to talk to you about next time that the CIP process, but also looking ahead to potential 2024 GO bond referendum. And what Andrew's going to do today is he's going to kind of introduce to you all kind of the types of debt that are out there that the city of Asheville utilizes, talk a little bit about the local government commission and their role in all of this and the debt issuance, share with you all a calendar for what a GO bond referendum might look like in terms of the dates and the things that you all would have to take action on as a council. And then Andrew's going to come back next month. He and I are working together right now to update our CIP and debt model. And he will be back next month to kind of give you all an idea of where we're at and what kind of financial capacity exists within that current model. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Andrew, and I'll just say, Gwen did a great job of introducing him. We've been working with Andrew and Doug Carter at DEC and Associates for I think it's been 10 years now, Andrew, I think, and it's been a great relationship. They really helped us develop that CIP and debt model that we have today. That's really been great for us to utilize from the beginning of our expanded CIP process about 10 years ago through the GO bond issuance. And so we really enjoyed working with Andrew and his team. So I'll turn it over to Andrew. I think he's got some slides to bring up.
Thank you, Mr. McDowell. I appreciate all those kind words. We very much have the pleasure of working with the city for just over a decade now. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Let me bring up this presentation and see if it works. All right. So just as Tony said, today is financing process in North Carolina, for lack of a better word, financing 101. And so first we'll start off, state statute determines what kind of modes you are able to issue debt in. And so NC state statute, there's technically about 6 different buckets of debt that you can issue. The first being general obligation debt, as we've been talking a lot today. It is a voted process. It can only happen on major elections. That was a change made a couple of years ago at the state legislature. It used to be on any election, but now it's on the major elections. So basically every 2 years. As we've been discussing, that authorization lasts 7 years, and you may get a extension for 3 more years for a total of 10 through another LGC process, which requires a petitioning of them, and then it goes to the LGC Commission themselves. The purposes for GEO, almost any purpose under the sun, GEOs can be used for. So everything from transportation and sidewalks that you are all doing, housing. There have been GEO votes for coliseums and ballparks and all kinds of things. So it can be used for almost any purpose. And of course, what you're pledging under a GEO is what's called the full faith and credit of the city, which means the almost unlimited taxing ability of the city to pay its bills is basically what you are giving them credit for. And GEO bonds are used everywhere in the state. Enterprise uses have waned given the ability to be able to discuss the complex nature of enterprise projects in water and sewer. So although those were popular back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it has become less popular across the state for enterprise uses. I think I heard someone raise their hand. Is there a question?
Yeah, Andrew, it's Gwen. Thank you. So what in the states, in your experience, how often do municipalities go back to the LGC and ask for that 3-year extension? And what's the success rate of that?
So, how many do it is probably a smaller percentage of those who have the GEO votes. There have been entities that have done it for specific reasons, of course. Sometimes, as a candidate for asking for an extension, housing is one of those things that tend to be one of those GEO questions that get extended simply due to the nature of being able to get those dollars out the door efficiently. I don't know of any that have been turned down by the LGC once they've gone for approval. There may be a couple of them out there in the history, but generally the LGC with relatively good reason will allow the extension. But there's no harm or foul technically. But it just means that you needed more than the 7 years to get through the spending from when you voted it originally.
Thank you.
Of course. The next bucket that you may borrow out of is what's called an installment purchase. And this is a pretty large statute that includes your limited obligation bonds, or LOBs, the LOBs, for long-term. That's a new name for a certificate of participation, which is what it used to be called about a decade ago. This is any general long-term installment debt. You're making an annual principal payment and semi-annual interest payments for X number of years. This process is non-voted, so through council actions, you can start the process of issuing limited obligation bonds without an authorized vote from the people on a GEO. The purposes are just about as broad as GEOs. You can issue limited obligation bonds for just about any general government purpose. What you're pledging there is the security is real collateral and real property. So most of the time you are pledging the asset that you are building. So if you're building a firehouse and you're borrowing money for it, you would pledge the firehouse, kind of very similar to as you would to your mortgage. Your house is the collateral for your mortgage loan that you have. Appropriation for the debt must be included in the manager's budget each year. Again, the LGC can compel you and to include the appropriation in your budget, even if council may decide not to. The LGC does have power to come in and compel, just like they might on the GEO side. Installment purchase, like I said, broadly used, almost all the uses that a GEO could be used, but they're just non-voted. The next one, installment purchase for equipment, is a little bit different animal because it does not require LGC approval. This is for your more short-term, 5-year or less and equipment, technology, computers, rolling stock for police officers or fire. That's mostly what this is in. A UCC filing is a fancy legal way of saying we're going to put a lien on just the concept of these projects. So we've moved away from actually leaning up the cars and the computers themselves, which makes it much easier for staff when and if there's an issue with a crashed police car or you're having to deal with titles and this, that, and the other. This is a very common use of getting equipment and computers across the state. I think I hear a hand up.
Tony?
Yeah, and I was just going to add on this first slide. So the city does, I think, as you all know, we utilize both the LOBs and the equipment loans as a part of our CIP. The bulk of our what we call our regular CIP outside the GO bonds are utilize the LOBs for debt. And then we do utilize the equipment loans as well for most of our purchases of vehicles, equipment, computers, like Andrew mentioned. So I'd really say and Andrew's got a second slide with some other types of debt that are used in North Carolina, but really most of the debt that we have here in City of Asheville are these 3 types on this particular slide. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. As Tony said, these next 3 are less commonly used in North Carolina, although they are available to you by state statute. The first one, special obligation bonds. The city has issued some special obligation bonds in the past, and these are a pretty unique way of it's basically the security that you might have to pledge for a specific type of project. In the city's case for special obligation bonds, a number of those were used in the downtown districts where a lot of public infrastructure, sidewalks, right-of-ways were going in. But those are very hard things to collateralize through a bank or through the public market. And so the security of a special obligation bond are a pledge of taxes or a pledge of revenues that you might put. It requires a municipal service district, which you have in the downtown area. And there's no technical statutory limit because it's based on the money that you are pledging under the security for the special obligation bonds. Usually those are sales taxes, other taxes and fees that the city does not directly levy. It's rarely used in counties because due to the setup of the way that a number of our sales taxes and other taxes and fees come in, counties don't have a number of those revenues to utilize. So the city, Asheville included, utilized this in the downtown area so that you did not have to lean up additional physical assets for those improvements in the downtown district that didn't have a real tangible collateral behind it. I believe the special obligations bond program right now is finished for the city. So as Tony said, most everything you're currently issuing are GOs, LOBs, or installment financings on the bank side. The last 2 I won't spend.
Andrew, I'm very disappointed that you didn't call it a sob.
Okay,
Can you just do it to entertain me?
Yes,
Okay.
the SOBs.
Okay. Thank you.
Everything has a acronym. So this LOBs, SOBs, GOs, and then the special assessment bonds, which I guess are SABs, although I'm not sure they have an acronym, and the tax increment bonds, which are TIFs or TIGs. Those are less used in the state, but we could look at ways of using them. As you see, you're pledging special assessment revenues. So you would create a district, you would tax them a particular tax just in that district, which would be used to support whatever services or capital that you might have. The city of Charlotte has a couple of these in the downtown area to help keep the trash and the prettiness and the continued plantings and such downtown for that district. And then tax increment bonds are essentially investments that are made where it may increase the property value in a particular area and you want to designate that new property tax increment to that specific payment of the bonds. It's not broadly used. Both of those are very complicated to get through the process. It requires many districts that you have to set up. And I believe under special assessment bonds, sometimes the people in that district have to vote for it as well. Any questions on these three before I move on?
Don't we have some TIFs set up, Deborah? In a few, or maybe the synthetic TIFs have been set up, but we haven't used them to borrow money.
I'm going to have to defer to Tony on that one. I know we had actually part of some in Charlotte, but I don't know in Asheville. Tony?
Yeah, no, we don't have any of those. I think you might be thinking about the municipal service districts that we have set up that allowed us to utilize the special obligation bonds. And I think we have 4 districts. I know we have downtown, we have the River Arts District, we have Charlotte Street. And
so those are the special assessment bonds. Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah, special obligation bonds require the designation of a municipal service district. And you do have the ability under law to technically raise revenue from those districts, but the city has not utilized that method. It was a requirement under law in order to issue the special obligation bonds that you did.
In our 4th district, Taylor reminded me, South Slope.
The next slide is going to talk about the role of the Local Government Commission, which is our state level bureaucracy that approves all forms of debt in North Carolina, except for those 59-month financings for rolling stock and equipment. They technically don't approve federal government loans. This would be loans maybe from the USDA or from other federal offices. They don't technically approve those. As we said before, the LGC can compel local governments to basically pay their debt in a certain sense. And in a GO fashion, they can essentially raise your rates if they have to. In North Carolina, I believe it's $1.50 limit for operations that you can tax, but there's technically an unlimited GO limit to pay the GO debt bills. So I also mentioned that they can also make sure appropriations for your other installment financing and limited obligation bond debt are also included in your budgets. Structuring. So the LGC has created some rules that are a little tighter than what the statute may say. So statute allows no more than a 40-year issuance for bonds. But under the guidelines from the Local Government Commission, they want to keep most every general government project to 20 years or less. There are a few circumstances where a 30-year maturity was approved by the commission. These are mostly for what you might call once in a generation type projects, building courthouses, large jails, stuff like that, where you may build one every 30 to 40 years. In enterprise bonds, 30 years is kind of the norm there. Level principal and interest for that. They normally do not require a debt service reserve. And for highly rated entities like the city of Asheville, they don't require a feasibility study, which helps lower the cost of doing those bonds. Mostly what we're talking here is water and sewer type of enterprise bonds. And then for construction period notes, these are the bands that we were talking about earlier. There's a 36-month bullet maturity. And what we mean by that is the principal's not due until the very end of the program. So it's an interest-only program, as we said before. It's a variable rate through the end of the program. And we do 36 months, even though we only really anticipate spending for 24. And this is done through negotiation with the LGC when these programs were put up. At the end of a 24-month spending cycle, we want to be able to have enough time for the city to go to the market when the market is good, and to also allow for any disruptions in the market to work themselves out. So as we see here, the 36-month time period for your current GEO construction notes that we have out are June of 2023. That's when that's the bullet. So we have to issue the money before then. And right now we're targeting a January or February time period in order to do that. So we'll still have some months that if we need to push it or roll it out a month or two, we're able to do so. The reason we use those is because, as we said before, it's very efficient in matching up the exact dollars that you spend over a time period to the dollars that we fix out long term. If we had fixed out the $25 million in the GEOs 2 years ago when we issued the bands, as you'll see, we're still trying to spend through some of that before we get to this the end period. So it allows us to not issue bonds up front and then spend a number of years to work through those bond funds to get them out the door. It's kind of you're doing it the opposite way. We're fixing it out after we've spent it rather than on the front end. And that's been very efficient for the city to maintain the lowest bond issuances that you can and to match up actual spending with actual bonds. There is a process. The LGC meets every Tuesday, at first Tuesday of every month. That's why it usually takes the 90 to 120 days, 3 to 4 months to bring a financing from the staff kickoff or actually council giving staff the permission to go forward to the closing of the bonds where you have access to the funds. There are multiple actions brought to council. There's usually an initial resolution that outlines what we're doing. Here's the bonds we're looking to issue. Here's the amount we're looking to issue and for what purposes. Many of the issuances of LOBs and other debt require a public hearing to which the citizens get to come out and formally put in their 2 cents, pro or con, for the project. And then there's usually an approving resolution towards the tail end where we usually know either rates or underwriter, the financing team, and you wrap up everything for council's actions on that before we go to pricing. The application itself is due about 1 month before the approval, but as you see, we start off a couple of months before that happens. So the formal application usually is a little more formalized by the time we submit it to the LGC, although they know we're coming months ahead of that. The biggest issue in doing an upfront financing and not the construction note financings that we've been doing is that if we're doing a brand new project, we have to have all bids and permits needed for the project in hand, no less than 3 weeks before approval. If we're doing one project, let's say I've been using a firehouse as an example. If we're doing one project, that's usually pretty easy to bring the bid and permit to the LGC. Another advantageous thing about the construction draw programs is we don't have to have all the bids and permits in hand as you're trying to spin through a list of 30 to 40 different projects. Just makes everything much more efficient. The sale will occur, sale of public bonds will occur after LGC approval. And then a couple of weeks after the sale, we get to closing and bond funds are able to be available to the city.
Andrew, just for my curiosity, who makes up this LGC? Is it like are they state employees or is it volunteer? Who are these people?
Fantastic question. So there's the staff of the LGC that are, good old normal workers like me and you, and they do much of the actual legwork. The commission itself is made up of the state treasurer, the state auditor, and the head of, I believe, the state revenue. And then there's 5 or 6 positions that are appointed, I think 3 or 4 from the governor and a couple more from someone else, I believe. So it's a mix of elected officials like the treasurer and such, and some appointed officials from other elected officials.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. And then just real quickly, is this a pretty unique kind of program? As a state, I mean, other states I've lived in, not that I would necessarily be aware, but I was not aware of anything like this. Is North Carolina sort of unique with this LGC?
You're absolutely correct. There are very few bureaucracies like this in the country. North Carolina is one of the few that has this. It can be a double-edged sword. Rating agencies give us a plus mark for having this type of bureaucracy that's overlooking the local issuance of debt. So it helps a good number of entities in the state to get to debt, especially smaller entities that may not be as sophisticated to bring debt to the market or only do it every 5 to 10 years when they have a project. But yes, it is a very unique bureaucracy as far as around the country as well.
But Andrew, you do mean bureaucracy in the most positive way imaginable, right? Okay.
Most definitely. It's a process, but it's a good process because they are basically making sure that your financial plan is sound and the project is sound, that you have your bids and permits, that you're not over borrowing and other type of things. So yes, it's just a process. And like I said, the rating agencies give everyone a plus mark in North Carolina.
And I would say it's one of the key reasons why you see so many triple rated entities, local governments in North Carolina, is because we have the LGC there to, serve as that risk mitigator, if you will.
Exactly right. North Carolina, I believe Virginia have the states, the two highest AAAs and highest ratings in the state. And that leads us right into the ratings, which was beneficial. What are bond ratings? Well, bond ratings are very similar to your own personal credit rating. So the entity of the city of Asheville has a credit rating. It's called a bond rating. And just like in your personal life, the higher your rating, the better rates you get from banks or from the public market. It's an indicator of financial strength. So when investors on the public market are looking to spend their dollars and invest in local communities, they really look to the credit rating for the financial strength of the entity and to basically say, we're going to get paid back if I invest in these bonds. So it provides lowest interest cost. It also provides debt structure flexibility and innovation. The LGC only allows construction period notes to be done by highly rated entities, of which the city of Asheville is one. So having a higher rating allows you to use the construction period financings to be more efficient with the way you spend your bond dollars. This next one's really very important. Having a high rating allows you to market access, especially during times of stress or in economic downturns. So 2020 is a great indication of this. COVID was coming upon us in the beginning of 2020. March started the official shutdowns and sending everyone back home. And this really caused a frenzy on the economic market. Given that all these different spending was going to have to happen, and people had their hands out to banks all across this country. So banks were faced with a lot of credit pressure with everyone coming to them, and Asheville was no different. 2020 is when we had finished the last draw program or the construction period program for your other bonds. We had issued those in January before COVID had really hit, before any of that was really on the radar. And we were in the time period where by June, we needed to enter into our next banknotes. And I'll have to say, with all the hands that were out, they could not all be filled, but Asheville's hand got filled, and we got filled with some really great rates for the time period that we were in. So really your credit strength gives you access to those markets, and we'll see that as we're getting ready to come to market again in the January or February time period, as we're in a little bit rate heightened arena. AAA will help drive that lowest interest cost down. And of course, it's an independent third-party recognition of the management that's going on here in the city. And of course, your policies that you have already adopted that govern any number of different ways you spend and the financial model, those are very sound drivers of your policy and keeping your rating up. And then very quickly, you'll see down there, I'm not going to read it all, but you'll see the Moody's rating criteria. Moody's is kind of the leader of the 3 rating agencies. And so you'll see that economy and tax base is about 30%. Most of that is not in your control. So, what kind of economic growth is, the tax base, the diversity of industry that's in the area, and median family income. The rest of the rating, about 70% of it, you have a lot more direct control. 30% of it is finances, how your fund balance levels are and the trends. Are they growing over a 5-year time period, or are they falling over a 5-year time period? Management is 20%. It is in this realm where they give us a plus for the local government commission for being able to look over the shoulder of local entities. And this is your budgets, your forecasts, how consistent have you been in budgeting and performing. And then the last area, of course, is debt and pensions. You would think that your debt burden would be more than the 20% of a rating. And actually, your debt burden is only 10% of the rating, because your pensions and how you funded your pension liabilities and your ARC is your other side, is your other 10% in that area. So many people would say that our debt level is a much higher percentage of the rating, but really it's only about 10%. So we'll get kind of more in the nitty-gritty now of how is, using all of these tools that we just talked about, what is Asheville's real method of financing here? And as we said before, Asheville has been utilizing what we call a cash flow form of capital financing. We issue short-term, what are called bond anticipation notes. Here's another good acronym, BAN, used for the expected spending over a 2-year project, 2-year period. So the city pays invoices, then actual spending is reimbursed monthly from the BAN. You spend, you see how much you spend, you ask for reimbursement that comes back into your coffers so you can spend again. At the end of the 2-year period, the BAN's refunded into the long-term debt that we talk about, into a long-term GO or a long-term LOB. And typically those have been the general 20 years that the LGC recommends for general projects. And again, we've said this a number of times, the long-term bonds are issued for the actual dollar spent. And so there's usually no unspent draw funds there, although we did talk about how with the GO program and the timing of having to issue that money, we might need to issue the rest of the housing money before the end of the 7-year period. So here you have the basically the cycle. You budget the projects, those are adopted by council and the spending. Then we get into the construction period. The city pays those invoices and then are reimbursed from the BAN that we have. Then at the end of that 2-year period, we issue the long-term debt for those projects for the 20 years. And then now we're making debt issuance payments on that debt that we issued and kind of start the process all over again. So as Tony said, we're in the process now of looking at this kind of first budgeted bucket to update the model to be able to bring back to you to look at potential money you have to spend in the model and what size GO programs we can start looking at and some of those as well. So I know we're all thinking about the next GO bond referendum for the city, as the last one is coming up on its last year basically of the issuance. It's a process. It takes essentially starting in about May to get to that vote in November. So I believe the next major election is going to be in 2024. So in May of 23, you would start your first official actions council would pass a resolution that would basically state your intentions, the sizes of the projects you're looking at, and what we call the geo questions. What buckets are they falling in? Is it transportation? Is it parks and rec? Is it housing? Is it streets? Is it for whatever purposes you are looking at? So the first action in the May time period really kicks off the entire process. And so a lot of what ends up happening is you do an action and then you alert the public, and then you do another action and you alert the public. And so you do your May action, you alert the public in a public notice in the newspaper that you have done this and that you intend to submit an LGC application. Staff will do that application and submit it to the LGC. Then in June, you start adopting the formal bond orders and then setting the public hearing date. And next, you publish notices of telling the public at the public hearing and that you have introduced a bond order. In July's meeting, you would hold that public hearing and allow the public to come and speak pro or con for the projects. At that meeting, council, I guess, depending on the public hearing, will then adopt the bond order and set the referendum date, which would be the November election. You then publish another notice of the bond order, and then sometime in the September or October time period, the LGC will approve your application for the referendum to go on the ballot in November. You then have to publish a couple of more notices to make sure the public knows that this vote is coming. And we have the November election, of which the referendum will be held. I know it takes a day or two to get those results in. And then after the election, usually the next meeting after the election, when the results have been certified, you codify a resolution with the official results, either a yay or a nay on the GEO referendum, and then you publish those referendum results. And so if you get the yay, then you have the clock starts, and that's when the 7-year clock starts for the amounts that you have issued. If you get the nay, it just kind of goes sailing into the night, and we may try again next time. So as Tony shared, each question will get its own vote. So Parks and Rec will get its own vote, transportation will get its own vote, housing. So each of the different purposes would have their own individual votes.
So Andrew, this is Gwen. Is this, so first of all, you said originally May of 2023. You meant May of 2024.
I did. I'm sorry.
Okay, I just,
It's the year of the election.
Yeah. So can you start this earlier, or is this the prescribed timing?
You could start the first, we could do it in March or April if you wanted to start the first resolution. It's really about making sure you know what numbers you want to go out with. So this, I would say, is probably the latest you can start to get to a November election.
Okay, so that was my question. I mean, if we wanted to, start at like the beginning of a calendar year, just to, have time to make, I remember when we did the bond several years ago, because we started so late. I mean, I just remember we were crunched. I mean, we were doing back-to-back public meetings. I mean, I probably did, and I mean, I was nothing compared to the mayor, but I mean, I probably did 15 in a month period of time. It was kind of crazy. So I was just, I was thinking that this is kind of like the latest in a time frame.
I think y'all started a little later the first time, which is why it required such a crunch to get done. Because although I haven't stated some of it, a good number of these notices, especially towards the end of the period, require certain periods they have to appear in the paper. So
right.
We're by law having to notice at certain time periods. So it just backs the whole calendar up. I think if you started in May, that would give you a pretty comfortable time period. You'll see you have a May action, June action, a July action, and then you're kind of waiting for the LGC to do their approval, and then you're all good to go for the November election. But it could move a little bit based on your own personal schedules the council wants to do.
Okay. Sage, your hand's up.
Yes, thank you. This is precisely what I had requested, so I really appreciate staff pulling this together for us because I just did not understand the whole process. And this is more a question for staff then, knowing this timeline for, the required steps, how much time ahead of that do we think we need as a city staff to prepare for this kind of momentum? And I ask as someone that may or may not be on the ballot in 2024, or may or may not want us to, chase some bonds for that election period. And I wouldn't know where to begin. So a year ahead for staff? I'm just kind of curious.
Deborah, I saw you nodding. I don't know if you had something you wanted to add or.
No, I'll back clean up if you want.
Certainly jump in. So, our intent is, and like I said, you'll be hearing from Taylor at the next meeting that you all have in October to talk about the current year CIP process. And our intent is as we're working with departments, is that we're building that list of potential 2024 projects as we're doing this year's CIP. Now, we will have some key pieces of information that we'll still need to gather, and some of that relates to our facilities. And I think you all know there's a facility assessment underway right now, and we're not going to have that data really until the spring or so of next year. And so we'll still be pulling together data then, but we hope to start getting, preliminary list of projects during this budget process.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, when we issued the GO bonds back when, we did not raise taxes to pay for that specifically. I mean, there have been rate increases since the GO bonds were issued, but we never tied it directly to issuing the bonds, if I recall. Am I right, Tony?
No. So we did. So and you may.
We did specifically? Yeah,
there was a 3.5-cent tax rate increase to pay the debt service from the GO bonds. I think the reason you may not remember it specifically is because it happened in a revaluation year. And so instead of us actually bumping the rate up, we just didn't lower the rate all the way down to revenue neutral.
Okay. But did we talk about it to pay for the bonds? I just don't really remember that being like the reason. I think we just, but.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we did. In fact, I think we had to for transparency purposes.
Okay.
We were talking about when the vote actually happened. So.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Sage?
Sure. My one last question. So, and that brings to mind the one remaining chunk of this I don't quite understand, which is, I think I do, the full bond cycle. Like if we were to be doing bonds every 4 years, every 8 years, and how that plays out over the decades, because we've raised taxes, we've paid off the debt, the tax level's still there. If there is a way in the future that we could kind of understand that process over a few decades, I would sure appreciate comprehending that. It seems like more long-term planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Andrew, you're about to say something.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tony. I'll jump in. So this is all part of the long-term planning y'all have been doing and continuing. So the financial model kind of creates your ability to look at those decade or 2 decades ahead. So part of what Tony was saying before, part of what we're doing now is looking at what's the CIP for the LOBs and the that side of the coin, and we're looking at, given the resources that are dedicated to the model currently, as debt pay down happens, as the other things that happen in the model, we're able to integrate forward-looking debt into it to project what you can and cannot afford in the next bond cycle and the bond cycle after that. So I think what we're getting to is, for lack of a better word, like a perpetual swing. What can we do every 4 years in the GO process without having to raise taxes? So the financial model and the long-term process, the planning that y'all do, that's what we're working on now to be able to deliver to you in the next couple of months to start getting prepared for, well, what kind of GO bonds do we want to do, and how much can we afford with our current resources? And if we want more, might that cost us if we want it? And so that's why we're basically, as you said, how long does this process take? We're basically starting now to get us to May of 2023 in order to figure out a lot of those questions. And that's what happened last time. I think a number was looked at, and the pennies that were generated to help pay for the new GEO program, that was integrated into the long-term financial plan. If we had looked at the 74 million of the GEO bonds that you passed first, kind of standalone and to itself, it would have cost more than those pennies that you raised. So because we're integrating it into the model, we're able to look at what you're able to afford, looking at what revenues you have dedicated to it.
That's perfect. That's what I needed to hear. Thank you. And like how often we would need to do, I think would be helpful. And so fellow councilwoman, one of the things I'm thinking about in this is also our housing trust fund, which you just heard we may, move $6 million into, but it's a replenishing loan fund. So, 20 years from now, I'm trying to look at like, where is the housing crisis in 20 years and where are the funds that we'll have to address it? Because HTF will be coming back in as projects are paid off, bonds will be paid off and maybe recycling. So I'm trying to look at it, 30-year housing plan, and this is a big component. So helpful today. Thank you, everyone.
Deborah, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you. Sage, you asked how long should we be thinking about this? Staff actually in 2020, unfortunately, brought this to finance and HR to talk about getting into this rhythm or this cycle of GEO bonds and what it would take and discussions. And so we've been thinking about it. And the past council was, provided with information, but then obviously COVID and all kinds of things, the world changed, quite frankly. And so now we're getting back refocused, and we want this committee to be an integral part of helping staff think through, should there be a 2024 look at another bond referendum. But what we will say definitely is that there is tremendous need in terms of from a capital infrastructure perspective, but there is also, the financial aspect. We do not want to put this community at risk of ever defaulting. And so there's a lot of analysis and assessment that goes into whether you issue a bond, and we don't take that lightly.
I'll make one last comment. When I believe you asked about, the local government commission being a unique entity, the local government commission was formed in the late 1920s after the Great Crash. And at that time, the city of Asheville was the largest city in North Carolina. And the city did default on some bonds in the 1920s. And the local government commission was formed to make sure that would never happen again in the state. And we laugh a little bit on the history of the city. The default did happen back in the 20s. And, your credit rating, if you default on debt, your credit rating is not the best. Although the city regained its AAA credit rating, I believe, in 16 or 18, and or right around 2018 or 2020, right around there. And so we have definitive proof that it takes about 100 years to go from default to get a AAA again. But the city has been through this before, but it is also our intention to never have that ever happen again. And that's what the financial planning and the model helps you do.
Thank you.
I think that was also, did I read correctly in our history? That was when the city council was indicted.
And I think
The mayor
jumped out a window or something. Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't good.
Yeah. Let's not do that again.
Yeah, let's not do that. Right.
Well, I didn't have any more slides. I was down to questions. So.
Okay. Anyone have any more questions for Andrew or Tony okay. Thank you so much. And we look forward to next month.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to public comment. Alicia, do we have anybody on the line? Are the thousands of people that are waiting to give us comments? Go ahead and open it up.
No, there are no callers in the queue.
Are there any callers anybody even listening?
No, we're not on public input.
Oh, I'm disappointed. It's disappointing, but thank you. Appreciate your keeping track of it. We're one of the very popular committees, apparently. All right. Well, with that, we will see everyone. Well, not everyone tonight, but a big chunk of you tonight. So, and I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Everyone.